a discussion about disinformation, extremism, and why troops should be aware. Today, June 12th, 2023. Good morning, Early Birds. I'm Jonathan Lehrfeld, and this is the Early Bird Brief, produced by Defense News and Military Times. Today, podcast producer and Military Times reporter Zimone Perez talked with military veterans and journalism fellows Allison P. Erickson and Nikki Wentling. As a part of an 18-month project through a partnership between Military Times and military veterans in journalism, Allison and Nikki will be reporting about disinformation and extremism as the issues relate to veteran and military communities. The pair talked with Z about frequently asked questions about extremism and disinformation in the military and much more.
Allison Erickson, Nikki Wentling, thank you guys for joining the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, where were you guys before you joined Military Times as MVJ Fellows?
I'm Allison Erickson. I am an Army veteran. I was Medical Service Corps. I served on active duty for 7 years. I studied journalism in undergrad, and I thought at the time that I could commission into a public affairs officer position, but the only branch at the time that did that was the Navy and Marines. I had to choose something, and I chose Medical Service Corps because it had served my family well in the past. When I finally left the military in 2018, end of 2018, I started a program to sort of reignite my interest in journalism. I just finished a fellowship with the Texas Tribune, also in partnership with Military Veterans in Journalism. So I'm coming with a military background and re-entering into the journalism space relatively recently.
Yeah, and I am not a veteran, but I have reported about veterans for quite a while now. So I'm from Central Kansas originally. I attended the William Allen White School of Journalism at the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk. Then I worked at newspapers in Kansas and Arkansas before making my way to DC in the summer of 2016, which, if you remember, was just a few months before the presidential election. So I worked for Stars and Stripes for 6 years covering veterans policies and the Department of Veterans Affairs. During that time, I traveled all over the U.S. talking to veterans about how VA policies or congressional legislation affected their lives. I reported extensively about COVID-19 and how it was being handled by the VA. And I was with Stars and Stripes in 2021 when the January 6th attack on the Capitol occurred. It came to light pretty quickly that there were a number of veterans and service members involved in the riot that day, so I covered some of the fallout there. I took a break from DC coverage last year and reported about technology for about a year, so I'm coming back to covering veteran and military communities with this new focus on extremism and disinformation. And that stint as a technology reporter is proving valuable given the advances with artificial intelligence and their potential to be a disruptor as far as disinformation and misinformation go.
So if you could kind of tell listeners what your role is as a military veterans and journalism fellow within our newsroom. What are your goals? What is the mission that kind of spearheaded you guys joining our organization for these next 18 months?
I heard about this fellowship opportunity through Zach Badorf, one of the co-founders of MVJ. So it's a relatively new organization, but they worked really hard right away to plug veterans into really well-established news organizations because they saw a need for newsrooms to have veterans in their ranks. It was sort of like a glaring gap, if you will, and there's benefit to having veterans in newsrooms all around, but also a benefit to having a focus on the military community as a whole. So you don't have to be a veteran to be a member of MVJ, but you do have to kind of have an interest in or a connection with the military community in a meaningful way. So this fellowship came about because Zach Badorf, one of the co-founders, as I mentioned, this was sort of his big project, his brainchild. He has worked with the State Department in the past and really just saw a need for this sort of work to be done at a larger level and to really help influence and impact the military community and have the resources, the focus and intention to really dig at core issues in the military community.
Yeah, and I can add on there a little bit. So, Military Veterans in Journalism has this program to counter disinformation, among veteran and military communities. And our part of it is funded, by the Knight Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, and Military Times keeps its editorial independence in our part of the project. So while we work to uncover what types of disinformation are being fed to these communities and the effects they're having.
And this next one might sound like a no-brainer to people tasked with reporting on extremism and disinformation in the military and veteran communities, but why is there a need for this kind of reporting and this kind of attention on extremism and disinformation, particularly among service members and veterans?
So, we know from data so far that extremists account for small percentages of veterans and service members overall, but that data also tells us that when veterans and service members are involved in extremist movements, whatever they may be, they tend to play an outsized role. So they're leaders, they have access to important information, they tend to be more successful sometimes in carrying out extremist-driven violence. So given that, our aim is to explore what kind of radicalization is happening in these communities, what kinds of information they're being fed and from where. We also want to focus on solutions. We're asking experts what they're suggesting in order to prevent radicalization in the first place. And we're, being watchdogs of Congress, the VA, the Pentagon to understand and report about their efforts to tackle this problem or their lack of effort.
Additionally, what's been in the news lately, as Nikki has reported in the past, the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, the veteran community had an outsized influence on who was actually even charged, who was there on that day. And so the world came away with this takeaway of what's happening with the U.S. military. And so in a way, we're trying to answer that question while also looking at questions like, is the military actually more likely to be radicalized, or are they more targeted with radical messaging, and why? Some of these are things that we've started to answer. Some of them we hope to answer throughout the course of this fellowship. And it's been really interesting to see responses from all sides already. We've already gotten some interesting feedback.
I guess for some folks who might just be curious or, to be candid, might be skeptical of reporting on, quote, extremism, I would be interested to know on how you are approaching these definitions of extremism and disinformation that accompanies your reporting. How are you tackling that kind of issue?
That's a good question. And part of what we're doing day by day, I think we're learning what the definition of extremism, disinformation, misinformation are. To start with, we published recently an explainer piece on what is extremism, what is disinformation, and I encourage everyone to take a look. We don't just make this up. We consult sources who've been in the industry looking at this for a long time, well before January 6th, and what we found has been very interesting. And I think to an extent, when you look at technology, which is why I'm very glad we have Nikki on the team, that definition can change. Those examples of what these types of disinformation in particular can look like, they evolve over time. So there are a few organizations, academics, professionals, experts that we consult to kind of see who else is keeping tabs on the space. These definitions don't come out of our heads, basically.
Yeah, Allison made a great point there that, we're not relying on one source for, understanding, what these things are. We threw it out there and looked at a variety of sources and brought all those definitions together. And we'll keep paying attention to, how different experts, sources are, looking at these things.
So what have you found so far about extremism in the military and veterans communities? We know that the Pentagon has taken steps to address some concerns, with Secretary Austin ordering a stand down for troops to learn about how to counter extremism among the ranks. You reported a really great article about the RAND study, asking service members and veterans about their extremist views. What have you found so far from that and from other reporting?
About the RAND study, it was a recent survey from RAND Corporation, which is a DC think tank. And that survey found that veterans weren't any more likely than the rest of the U.S. population to harbor extremist ideologies, which at face value is a good thing. But there were a couple of caveats with that survey. One was that it asked veterans to self-identify as extremists, and there's question of whether participants, honestly answered that question. And another thing, the survey found that, nearly 30% of veterans believed in the Great Replacement theory, which is a conspiracy theory about non-white individuals being brought into the U.S. to replace white voters. And that is less than the overall population. 35% of the U.S. adult population believes in that theory, according to Rand, but it's still really alarming, right? I spoke with one expert who said extremists with military backgrounds tend to be more likely to carry out violence, and that 30% statistic terrified him, to put it in his words. So there are different things we can take from that Rand report, but one thing we know is that it's being held up by some Republican lawmakers as a reason that the country shouldn't focus on the issue of extremism in the ranks, while a lot of experts and veterans groups are saying, no, that's not the case. It shows that we need more focus on this issue.
Yeah, the Rand study was an interesting one, and it in a way, I'm glad Nikki tackled it, gives you sort of a pulse for why this is a kind of a politically charged issue. Because if you think about it, if 30% of the population believes in the Great Replacement theory, military or not, even if it's outsized, it's not good for anybody. This is an extreme thought that is being, or a conspiracy theory that is being promulgated in a way that's a little scary. So what's interesting about that is some members of the GOP are advocating to remove extremism training and like the mandated stand downs that Secretary Austin ordered for the troops. What's interesting is it seems to be that there is still a concern of sorts. It's just, how do we tackle it? How do we deal with it? Is it the troops' problem? Is this something that's more like insider threat training? Or is this a bigger issue that we have to tackle and address? And so that's something that we're looking at with this fellowship too, is where is this conversation going? Where is it leading? And who are the most vocal advocates and proponents for looking into extremism?
A lot of people think the focus shouldn't just be at the Pentagon because there are more, veterans involved in this kind of thing than active duty service members. So does the responsibility fall with the Pentagon to give, training as they transition out? Or, is it a more whole of society approach? One veterans group is arguing that, it needs to start, with kids in school getting more civics education and media literacy and that sort of thing. So, that's a good point. We're trying to explore what people are seeing as solutions right now.
We'd be remiss not to mention that the Rand study also looked at far left extremist views, and it wasn't just a look at far-right extremism among the military. It's across the political ideologies. Has the stand down also reflected that? It's not just a far-right extremism stand down, but it's more so just any radical or extreme ideologies across the board?
Right. So our beak definitely covers all extreme, not just ideologies, but violent actions. That's what both the DoD and Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigations, they've all basically said, with our First Amendment protections in place, we can say as many hateful things as we want, but it's when it tips into violent action that it becomes, in some people's eyes, like domestic terrorism. So that depends on who you speak with, but for the most part, that's what we're focused on, are the actions. So yes, like when it comes to, you mentioned Antifa and some other groups have been affiliated with like far left extremist ideologies. But what we've seen in the research so far has been that the far right and especially white supremacist groups are more likely to commit domestic violent extremist actions, right? So they're the ones more likely to commit acts of harm, which is why the focus typically has been in that area, but they're definitely not the only extremists committing acts of violence. In our explainer, we also cover some of the sort of seminal cases of military domestic violent extremism. You have, for example, the 2009 shooting at Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos, with Major Nidal Hassan. His was an act of Islamic extremism, right? So not necessarily far right or far left, but an act of extremism based on an extreme ideology.
Yeah, Allison's exactly right. And the RAND report specifically, it didn't look just at far right extremism. It divided it into 4 categories, which was white supremacy, Black nationalism, neo-Nazi, and Antifa, the far left anti-fascist group. And actually, of that, 1% of participants said they supported white supremacists, while the most support was for Antifa at 5.5%. So that was an interesting finding too. We're seeing data, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism collects data about extremist crimes. So, like the actual acts like Allison was referring to. And a lot of that data is showing, far right extremists tend to carry out crimes more often. So that also has to be a focus of ours because it is the acts that are happening.
Allison and Nikki, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today. We're looking forward to having you on more in the future.
Thank you for having us. Happy to be here.
Thank you for having us.
That's it for us this morning. To get more of the top stories and breaking news, go to defensenews.com/EBB to subscribe to the Early Bird Brief newsletter. Please give us a like, rating, and a comment wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media at @defense_news and @Military Times. The Early Bird Brief is hosted by me, Jonathan Lehrfeld, and produced by Simone Z. Perez. If you liked our conversation today, be sure to check out Nikki and Allison's work at militarytimes.com. Also, please rate us and leave a comment on whatever platform you use. Our editor-in-chief is Mike Gruss. Have a great day.